What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett, where we break down all the biggest action from the last Saturday in college football and talk to you about the implications, especially on the college football playoff. If you're going to enjoy this video, please leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so that you're always up to date whenever I post. Without further ado, though, let's dive into this week's episode. So, quickly explaining, last week I actually had a video filmed. I started doing a little bit of editing, and I ended up traveling down to Florida and had a little vacation. Didn't really get around to doing too much editing, so that's why there wasn't a video last week up on the channel. There wasn't a whole lot of takeaways, just kind of mentioning a few quick ones. The last Bedlam, that was a big game 2 weeks ago now. Texas holding on against Kansas State. Ole Miss getting a win, which ultimately, because of their loss this week, it doesn't really matter too much anyways. And Georgia being able to defeat Missouri. But that was kind of last week's takeaway. That's about all I'm going to have on last week. Now let's get into this past week, yesterday's games as I'm recording this on Sunday. So it started out with, I would say, probably one of the two marquee games, Michigan going to Happy Valley to face Penn State. The Nittany Lions offense was honestly hard to watch throughout the game. Yes, the Michigan defense is very, very good. They are, I think, probably the best defensive unit in the country. Georgia's right there with them. Penn State is too. They just don't have an offense to really get much done. Obviously, Iowa kind of in a similar boat to Penn State in terms of having so many offensive struggles. But Penn State, I would say, has some more options and weapons than Iowa does. Buckeyes defense is up there at Ohio State, and then Georgia is as well. And there are, of course, teams that rank up in the upper echelon of defensive statistics that aren't, among the top teams that are winning. But it was a good defensive game. I think both offenses, they did a good job running the ball. I think Michigan had well over 200 rushing yards, and that was especially the case with Blake Corum, 26 carries for 145 yards, 2 touchdowns, and then Donovan Edwards, 10 rushes for 52 yards and a touchdown. I have, shout out Joe, my friend who's a Michigan fan. I texted him and I said, I think really the Michigan run game is at its best when they utilize both of those two running backs at the same time, because something that we've talked about throughout the season is it seems like maybe sometimes they're not using Edwards as much as they are Corum, and that proved in the carries today. But I think it was giving Edwards, the opportunity to get some carries, and I think the 10 carries is probably a little bit more than his season average per game. I'll have to pull up his stats on that and verify that in post, but I think the Michigan ground game continues. I mean, that's what's been their strength the last couple of years. J.J. McCarthy, I think, was like 7 for 8 for 60 yards, and all those throws were in the first quarter and a half. He didn't throw a single pass after, I think, midway or late in the second quarter, which is kind of incredible. Yeah, the Michigan ground game is really all they need at times, and they went against the Penn State defense that was among the best at stopping the run. And so I think that's something for Ohio State to be prepared for in a couple weeks, that it's going to be tough once again to stop the Michigan ground game. I think it's going to be key, though, to be able to limit anything in the passing game, because Penn State stuck around. I think, for the most part, Michigan had control in this game and were able to get the W, winning by 9 points, kind of holding off Penn State throughout. But another talking point, though, Penn State's quarterback, Drew Aller. I think Penn State probably going into the game plan was to run the ball a little bit more, but the former 5-star quarterback goes 10 for 22, 70 yards, and 1 touchdown. And I think some of the throws were Michigan pressure, and that plays a pivotal role, and sometimes it's tough to see that. I know there was one play where I thought a pass was awful. They showed the instant replay, and you could see that his hand was getting hit as he threw the ball, and so the ball was nowhere near where it was supposed to go. So that's probably a majority of his poor throws, of the 12 incompletions was that. But really, there were certainly a couple of throws where he just completely missed the mark on his throws. And so, whether that's nerves in a big game, I feel like I've seen it pop up here and there throughout the season a little bit. It popped up, both quarterbacks didn't look good in the Ohio State-Penn State game earlier this year. But certainly something for Nittany Lion fans to keep an eye on, because he's expected to be around for a couple of years. So those are kind of takeaways from that. Again, the Michigan defense is among the best in the country, if not the best. Their offense, the ground game is dominant, and they are still. I'll get into this discussion a little bit more towards the end of this video, but I think they're right there. Michigan and Georgia are probably, I would say, almost clearly the top two teams. I think both now have the boosted resume that had been kind of the College Football Playoff Committee's excuse for putting Ohio State one, or maybe not excuse, but their reasoning behind it. And I think now Ohio State might still have slightly a better resume, but I don't think so anymore. I think Georgia and Michigan have either equaled or maybe even potentially surpassed Ohio State's resume, probably more so equaled. And so I think this week I would expect the committee to move both Georgia and Michigan up. And as of right now, I would have Georgia number one, and that's because of the way that they just absolutely dismantled Ole Miss. The Rebels are a very good offense, and I know Jackson Dart went down in the third quarter with an injury. Hope he has nothing but a speedy recovery from that, and that it doesn't affect his play for the rest of this season. But he leads a very strong Rebels passing attack that looked good early in the game. They got a couple touchdowns, in the first quarter or so of the game. But after that, the Dawgs defense was dominant again. They completely shut down, again, one of the top passing attacks in certainly in the SEC. And so Georgia, their offense as well looked good. Brock Bowers came back. He didn't have a huge statistical game, caught a touchdown pass, but made an impact on the field. I was watching Chris Fowler. Chris Fowler has a weekly nightcap recap on Instagram. I was watching that this morning. I think it's a good thing. You don't want to take from what other people are saying and just repeat it, but as long as you give credit where it's due, I think it's good to have input from a variety of different sources than just my own thoughts. And so that was something that he saw, obviously calling the game on ABC with Kirk Herbstreit, or I think it was on ESPN. Being able to see that Brock Bowers was making an impact in his first game back from that tightrope surgery that Tua Tagovailoa has had. So a good game for him. Ladd McConkey had a good game. There was a really sweet story on College Game Day previously about him and a young fan who I think Ladd is the kid's favorite player. So that was really sweet and cool to see. The kid got a ticket to the game and just broke down crying on the game day set. So that was a special moment kind of in the build up to the game. But my takeaway from that, Georgia has, I think, established themselves as still the best team in college football, because I think it was a matter of just proving it. Like they've the last 2 years they have been the best team in college football. Going into this season, you'd expect them to be the best team, but I think they still had to. It's a new season. They have to go out there. They have to prove it. They have to get things done. And they've done that recently, and probably the last couple weeks, in the last month, kind of overall, kind of starting, I would say, with that win over Kentucky. That was kind of their first tough test. And then they beat Kentucky, they beat Florida, they beat Missouri, and then they beat Ole Miss. They have a couple of games, you gotta be careful for. They'll definitely, I'm sure Kirby Smart will be emphasizing not getting caught up in looking ahead to that SEC championship game against Alabama. But they got 2 road games to close the regular season, at Tennessee and at Georgia Tech. Both of those games just need to be aware, but I think they are back at the top of the pile. I think Michigan is very much, it's Georgia, and then Michigan is like a, 1B type thing. And those teams are very much, I think, equal. On the field, I think that would be a very competitive game. As they're playing right now, both teams are playing well, but I do think that Georgia would get the job done against Michigan. Of course, those teams, based on my rankings, could only face off in the national championship game, so we'll have to see how that shakes out. But I do think Georgia is slightly better. I think Michigan is a very close second. Ohio State's third. They took care of business against Michigan State with a gray out. Those uniforms did end up looking pretty cool on the field. In some of the releases, I was like, those are kind of cool. Not the best thing I've ever seen, but I think they looked really slick on the field and was cool to be able to wear those for a night game, even against a reeling Michigan State team who, albeit did get their first win for a while against Nebraska last week. So then once you get past those 3 teams, it was the case of a lot of teams, not all, but a lot of teams being in some close battles. You have Florida State holding off a Miami comeback. I wish nothing for the best for the Hurricanes quarterback, Emory Williams, I believe a true freshman. who got injured during the game right away, was on the ground for a while, and it did look pretty bad. It was an arm injury. I think it was his left arm. His left arm was in a big old air cast or something like that to protect it. So I just wish nothing but a speedy recovery for him. But the Noles get a win over their rivals. They have, I think, the third longest active win streak in college football at 16 games. And so I think it's sometimes when you're looking at the very top teams, easy to overlook that a little bit. I know they're getting their due in terms of being, a top 4, top 5 team. But I think, Mike Norvell deserves a lot of credit for what he's done with that Seminoles program that after Jimbo Fisher left the job, was kind of, they were struggling for a few years. There were some lean years for Florida State, but they're back, to winning ways in Tallahassee. And it was close. They got back to a little bit of the struggles that they had kind of during the middle of the season in terms of games remaining maybe closer than they should have been. But the Noles get the win. Washington, very similar against the better team, a higher quality team. They put up 35 against Utah, which is the most the Utes have given up all season. Probably the top defense or one of the top defenses, not only in the Pac-12, but one of the top defenses in the country is Utah. And so Washington, they get a win. It's, survive in advance. The win is the most important thing. They had a play where I think it was going to be a pick six. They end up dropping it at the goal line. Still don't understand how that happens in college football. You don't see it really much in the NFL, but you certainly see it somewhat regularly in college football. It feels like it happens, a couple times a season is what it really feels like how often it happens. So just kind of a interesting takeaway from that one. Oregon, similarly, their defense looked good against Caleb Williams and the Trojans, held them pretty well in check throughout the game. 36-27 was the final there. I think USC got kind of a little bit of a late touchdown to pull a little bit closer, having been down for 15 for a good part of the game. So a good win for the Ducks. Bo Nix came out firing in that game. I think he was something like perfect, like 7 of 7 or maybe 7 for 8 in the first couple drives for like 160 yards and 2 touchdowns. Just tore apart the USC secondary like a lot of teams have done. But Oregon is able to get the job done and get the victory. And then another team that's up there, Alabama, they routed Kentucky on the road, and they have assured their spot in the SEC championship game against Georgia, which, they win that, and they I would assume would probably be in the playoff. That would certainly create an interesting situation, especially if, and maybe I'll dive into this a little bit more. Maybe I'll make a video on kind of the college football playoff outlook just to kind of limit this video from being too long. But it'd be very interesting to see what the committee would do if there's an undefeated Big Ten champ, whether it's Ohio State or Michigan, an undefeated Washington, an undefeated Florida State. Who gets that fourth spot? I mean, there's a lot of teams then that would be there if Alabama beats Georgia in the SEC championship game. It'd be both of those two teams, one loss, Alabama conference champ. Let's assume Texas wins out. They're Big 12 champs. They have one loss. And, so it'd be three teams competing for one spot, because obviously Washington finishing undefeated would knock out Oregon. But certainly something to keep an eye on there. And the one other team that I mentioned there, Texas, held off a kind of furious TCU comeback and were able to get the win. So a lot of the chalk held. It was kind of like a separation week is what some might call it. You have Georgia and Michigan both playing top 10 opponents that were kind of fringe. If those teams pull an upset, who knows? They could be, they could carry the momentum and get into the college football playoff, and that would really have shaken things up a little bit. But I think, kind of got a little bit more locked in on these, it's like 8 teams, I think. Louisville is there too, but there would have to be absolute chaos for the Cardinals to get there. They're 9-1. They struggled against Virginia, and speaking of that game, I just, nothing but prayers and well wishes for Paris Jones after that scary injury that he suffered, the Virginia player. Just wish, again, nothing for the best, praying for him. But again, this week was, what I like to call kind of a little bit of a separation week. You have teams distancing themselves from the rest of the pack at the top of the picture. Pop up my rankings here. I'll just kind of go through it quickly. Not really going to give takeaways because I have throughout the video. But Georgia number 1, Michigan number 2, Ohio State 3, Florida State 4, Washington 5. Those teams are close. Oregon 6. Oregon's also close. If it wasn't for that loss to Washington, I'd probably have them ahead, like if those teams hadn't faced yet or whatever. So I'd have, Oregon 6, Texas 7, still the head-to-head. I value that very much, ahead of Alabama at 8, and then Louisville at 9. And really outside of that, there aren't really any teams that are in college football playoff contention, but a couple of teams that are in the top 25 that have had really good turnarounds this year. Shout out Mizzou. They routed Tennessee in the 3:30 SEC game, so a lot of eyeballs were probably on that one. So really good win for the Tigers to get them to 8-2. And then Arizona, they get a win over Colorado. Colorado is not looking good for even making a bowl now. But Arizona, I think, is up to 7-3 now. So they've had a really good season, an amazing turnaround. They're ranked and they're playing really well. So shout out Jed Fish and the Wildcats out there in Tucson. But that's it. Week 11 takeaways, breakdown, letting you know all you need to know about this past week in college football and a little bit of an outlook ahead. I think maybe sometime in the middle of this coming week, I will do a video looking at college football playoff scenarios. I absolutely love either writing about that sort of thing or just talking about it, talking about all kinds of different scenarios depending on who wins and who would get into the playoff and speculating on that. I might wait till Tuesday when the rankings come out and break those down a little bit too. So stay tuned for that video. But if you've watched the end of this video, thank you so much for taking the time to watch College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. I'm your host, Peter, signing out. Have a great day. Peace.